Ken Ham, the founder of Answers in Genesis, a young earth creationist ministry, has claimed that his Harvard-trained employee, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, has found the Rosetta Stone of human history in this recently published book, Traced, Human DNA's Big Surprise. In this book, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson purports to have traced all of the male human lineages back to 3 sons of Noah at the global flood about 4,500 years ago. And in doing so, he has explored and shown how all humankind are descendants of these recent common ancestors. Has Nathaniel Jeanson found the Rosetta Stone of human history? Has he found a way to accommodate the scientific evidence to a young Earth timeline, a timeline that consists of only 4,500 years? In order to address that question, we're going to ask, what did Dr. Jeanson leave out of his analysis that might have changed his perspective on his results? I've titled this, Untraced Lineages Reveal Rosetta Stone Flaws. And that's what we have coming up next. So what is this book, Traced? Well, it's an amazing discovery. It's the Rosetta Stone of human history, as claimed on the sales page for Amazon, at Amazon.com. What it is really is it's a young Earth creationist hypothesis of human ancestry. And in a nutshell, what Nathaniel Jeanson has done is he has reinterpreted the Y chromosome haplotypes to support a recent 4,500-year-old origin of all human beings. And in order to do this reinterpretation of the Y chromosome phylogeny, or an ancestry tree, he has reassigned a faster mutation rate to accommodate his need to squeeze all of human history into a shorter time interval than we'll say the conventional viewpoint. And he compares then that shorter chronology, that young Y chromosome phylogeny, with various historical events, and tries to explain the peopling of the world since the origin of humanity. Okay, I've just used a bunch of big words: Y chromosome, haplotypes, mutation rates, phylogeny. Don't get too scared. I'm going to show a figure, and I'm going to talk you through it, a figure from Answers in Genesis that I think will give you the big perspective on what Jeanson's hypothesis is, so that we can then begin to assess it. Now, before we get to that particular image, and I sort of set the stage or set the scene of what a young Earth creationist view of human history is, let's talk about whether Jeanson's analysis makes sense, because this is going to be what I'm going to step through in terms of this talk. Point number 1, does Jeanson's analysis make sense? Absolutely it doesn't. There's not enough support for the substitution rate, or what he is calling the mutation rate, to justify the reinterpretation of conventional Y chromosome chronology. He hasn't sufficiently shown that he can truly compress the time scale from hundreds of thousands of years down to just 4,500 years by changing the underlying mutation or substitution rate. Now, we're not going to get into substitution rates and mutation rates in this particular talk. That's been sufficiently covered by others, but I want to point out that it is a fatal, or at least a significant flaw, right, in this book, and it underpins or underlies all of the results of the book. And so it's an extremely important point. But let's set that aside. In fact, let's say that Jeanson might be right, that it is possible to reinterpret the conventional Y chromosome chronology by simply speeding up the mutation rate, and therefore allowing all the mutations that have happened in the Y chromosome among all human beings to be compressed into 4,500 years. Let's grant him that. Let's say that's possible. I'm going to suggest that if he is right, he is going to create more problems for himself interpreting other data. And I'm going to note that he has left some data out that doesn't fit into that particular interpretation. And so point number 2 is he ignores inconvenient data, most notably Neanderthals. which Answers in Genesis believes are descendants of Noah. And so therefore, his hypothesis needs to incorporate Neanderthals in order for him to truly state that he has found the Rosetta Stone of human history, that he has explained the origins of all peoples. Furthermore, he can't accommodate other human fossil lineages. In his analysis, I believe that they're going to cause problems, and I'm going to try to show you why. Now, the fourth point I'm going to make is that if Jeanson is correct, if he's even close to being correct, then he has just laid bare a very big problem with Answers in Genesis views of what a kind is, right? What a group of created kinds are. Because they take chimps, gorillas, and orangutans, and they say they're a single kind, which means, as we're going to see, they all evolved from a single Y chromosome. And if Jeanson's correct, I think that view is untenable. And so if they're serious about saying that Jeanson's onto something here in terms of how he's reanalyzing Y chromosome data, they're going to need to reanalyze a lot of their other positions about diversity in other groups, not just human beings. All right, let's get after it. And we're really going to focus on 2, 3, and 4. And like I said before, we're going to introduce the whole idea by kind of hitting the big picture first. Then we'll come back and look at some specific problems. So this is an image from the Creation Museum. They have a display there about Lucy's relatives, right? The great apes. And what they're doing, of course, is they're contrasting the great apes with the separately created kind of human beings and trying to demonstrate how human beings are a separate creation and clearly different than all other living things on Earth. And in doing so, they try to explain, well, what are the great apes? And you'll see that there's a phylogeny. A phylogeny is simply a description or a depiction of the relationships of organisms and their common ancestors. Here we have a typical view of what young Earth creationists believe is the history of the world. Starting at creation, which would be about 6,000 years ago. So we have 6,000 years. They would propose, and this is what Answers in Genesis is proposing to hundreds of thousands of people that come to their creation museum and in their published literature, that there was an originally created great ape. The great ape kind. Might be multiple individuals of great apes, but nonetheless, one type of great ape. That great ape then might have diversified over time, right, after the sixth day of creation, and might have diversified into a variety of different lineages, maybe distinguishable separate species even, prior to a global flood, which happened about 4,350 years ago. And so at 4,350 years ago, this great flood destroyed all members of that kind except for 2, right, that were preserved on the ark. And that's why they're showing this dotted line. Those are the 2 individuals right there that survive via Noah's ark. They step off the ark, and what happens is, well, they're told to multiply and fill the world again. And as they do so, they multiply and begin to diversify. And again, they begin to diversify into a variety of lineages. Now, the dotted lines are just their hypothesis of how they might be related to one another, not based on fossils, because they don't have fossils from that particular period. And then the full lines represent like, okay, we see these individuals in the fossil record, and they persist through time, in this case, through the Ice Age and then to the present. So these are living representatives, right, descendants of the 2 apes that got off of the ark. So what do you see here? What you see here is you have just one original kind. You have 2 individuals, a male and a female, and it's the male that has the Y chromosome, and that's important for this particular discussion, right? So there's a single Y chromosome that's carried on board Noah's Ark. And after departing the ark and they begin to populate, right, that Y chromosome gets copied into all the subsequent males. As those lineages deviate, they get transferred into various lines, that Y chromosome is going to accumulate mutations. And that as they accumulate, we can use those mutations then to see the amount of difference between different lineages. And so today we have orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. And I don't want you to miss this. This is really important, critical. If you follow these three lineages back, which today we look at and clearly distinguish them as separately evolving lineages and obviously different species. But according to Answers in Genesis, if you trace them back, they share a common ancestor right here at Noah's flood. And not only that, but this is going to become important later too, we have Ardipithecus and we have the Australopithecines. I have trouble saying those words, so forgive me. A variety of other fossil lineages that don't persist to the present. And so there's a bunch of extinct lineages too, but all of those extinct lineages trace themselves back to just two individuals, and therefore every Y chromosome in any great ape, except for human beings, right? Because you see, you notice no human beings on this particular chart, must be related to that single Y chromosome there originally. That single Y chromosome would be, one chromosome, and it has a certain base pair sequence, A, T, C, G, C, G, C, G, T, right? And so if you compare an orangutan and a gorilla today, they don't have the same sequence. Well, why don't they have the same sequence? Because somewhere their descendants had mutations, and those mutations accumulated to the point where they persist today. All right, let's start over. What is the difference between this and human history? In human history, we have Adam and Eve, right? And Eve. Terrible writing, but you get the idea. Adam and Eve. What happened to Adam and Eve after being in the garden, right? They got kicked out of the garden and they begin to populate the world, right? They begin to fill the earth. And as they do so, they create lots of different lineages. Now, we don't call these different species for human beings, but we'd say there's different lineages of human beings, right, that start to populate parts of the world. But guess what? The Great Flood comes, right? And it destroys all life, right? All life with breath in it. And in doing so, there's only, not just two, right? There's Noah and his wife, and then his three sons and their wives. All right, so there's 8 human beings. But the critical thing here is Noah is preserved and his 3 sons. Where did his 3 sons get their Y chromosome? From Noah, which means there was only one Y chromosome that makes it through the flood. So there was an original Y chromosome in Adam. That Y chromosome got copied into thousands of individuals, and it probably had mutations and diversified. But then only one of those Y chromosomes could have been preserved on the ark. And therefore, that one Y chromosome would then have diverged into all the different people that are alive today. Like every single person alive today, right, is a descendant of Noah. And so any difference between me and you must be a difference that is derived from mutations from that original Y chromosome. And just to put a big bow on this whole talk and give away a lot of the story up front, but we'll stick around for some details. It's not just all of the modern humans, people alive today, but Answers in Genesis says, you see what's missing here on the great apes? There's no Neanderthals, there's no Denisovans, there's no most of the other Homo lineages you might have heard of, like Homo erectus. None of them are here. They're not on the great apes. Well, where are they then? Well, they're related to human beings, according to Answers in Genesis. They are human beings in their minds. And if they are human beings and they lived after the flood, because they're found in post-flood sediments, according to all young earth creationists, that means they're all descendants of Noah. So Noah's here. Some of their descendants turned into Neanderthals, Denisovans, and all these other lineages. Their Y chromosomes also must have evolved from Noah's Y chromosome. So all the Y chromosome variation that exists since the flood all has to be accommodated back to a single individual, a single Y chromosome. Now, conventional Y chromosome phylogenies suggest that there's too much variation, and the rate at which that variation accumulates, which would be the mutation rate, or what was more properly known as the substitution rate over time, wouldn't accumulate at a rate fast enough to accommodate all the differences between you and me and Neanderthals and so forth into just 4,500 years. So what Jeanson has done is he has his main accommodation, right? His main reinterpretation is to simply increase the mutation rate. Now he tries to find justification for that. Not going to get into all that, but he proposes a much faster mutation rate that then allows for all of the different hundreds of mutations that have occurred to all be squeezed into this 4,500 years. All right, so that's our big picture. Now let's work through some additional examples. Let's see what his conclusions are, and let's then look at some of his missing data and ask the question, did what he left out of his book, would it have made a difference in his interpretation? Does it increase the likelihood that he's right, or does it decrease the likelihood that he's right if we include that data? All right. Now, first, I'm going to show you, like, what did he kind of do? All right. What about this reinterpretation? So let's go back to a paper he mentions many, many, many times throughout his text and in his other papers. And that is this paper from 2015. And it's in the journal Genome Research by Carmine et al. Now, when I say et al., there's a long et al. There. Like, these are all the authors of this paper. A recent bottleneck of Y chromosome diversity coincides with a global change in culture. There's a lot of authors here. Some of them didn't have large contributions, but they're acknowledged. Nonetheless, I want to point out that there are hundreds of scientists, right, that are interested in these types of questions and study things like the Y chromosome, and have come to these types of conclusions over and over again in a variety of different analyses. So this isn't just a one-off, one person coming up with this. So Jeanson looks at all this and says, like, Carmine has some of the, the most recent analysis that really kind of encapsulates a lot of Y chromosome work. And an important figure from that paper is this one right here. And so this kind of captures, like, what's called the phylogeny, the history of all humans, all living humans in this case. And so what you're seeing here are the different Y chromosome haplotypes given different names. And I know that's going to be hard for you to see because there's A, B, E, D, C, F, and so forth. But the idea is that if you go back in time, right, you take everybody, this is the present right here. And if you work backwards in time, eventually you and I share a common ancestor, right? In fact, you and I and anybody else on this earth, we would go back and we'd say, at some point, we share a common ancestor, that common Y chromosome, if we're males. Females, we can talk about mitochondria, but for males, every male on the face of the earth shares a common ancestor somewhere. Now, if you are very similar to somebody else, then you share a common ancestor fairly recently. So you could say, like, I share my common ancestor at this point, only this far back. But if I'm in group C, or let's say, I think that's Q right there, and versus group L, well, then if I go back there, I would have to go, it's quite a while back before I find my common ancestor with you. And then there are some individuals, especially some in Africa, that have very, very deep lineages, meaning in this case, all you need to know what deep means is there's lots of different mutations, all right? They are genetically more diverse or distinct. And so you'd have to go much farther back in time in order to find the point at which you then have the same Y chromosome. All right, so this is the Y chromosome phylogeny. This is the conventional Y chromosome history of the human race that you're seeing right in front of you. Now let me blow this up a little bit. So now if we look at it a little bit closer, here's what Nathaniel Jeanson does. He actually he doesn't do his own real novel analysis, right? He's not taking all these Y chromosomes and doing his own analysis. He is trusting, he is accepting the conventional phylogenetic studies and their analyses with respect to how all these different groups are related to each other. That I and J are more closely related to each other than they are to other things. But what he does is he says, I don't accept the root of this tree, right? The root of the tree, let me go back. The root of the tree way up here, how did they determine how everything is related to each other. Well, they said, well, we're going to compare this to, say, to chimpanzees. And if you compare to chimpanzees, then this is how all of this breaks down. This is how the history of the human race breaks down. But of course, for young Earth creationists, there is no relationship of humans to any other group. And therefore, it's what's called an unrooted tree. There is no root. There is nothing to compare humans to. You compare humans to other humans. And so what he has done is he has said, I don't accept that root up there. I look at this particular phylogeny, this relationship tree, this, what he thinks is a genealogy. And I say that that right here, okay, right there, if I draw the root right there, this is basically where Noah is. All right, and if I say that this was Noah, and Noah's on the ark, and he has a Y chromosome, and then he has 3 sons, right? Here's one of the sons. One of the sons is right here, all right? And that's actually Shem. And then he has another son, and that son is right here. Gives rise to this group down here. So this group right here are descendants of that son, and that's Japheth. And then the other group, you know, if you follow this line over here, and, well, let's just put it right here. And this is Ham. And then he has a bunch of sons, right? And some sons are over here and go all the way down here, and some sons have mutations that end up down here, and some have mutations that eventually mutate and mutate and mutate and eventually become these groups, right? So all of this, everything over here is a descendant of Ham. So you have Ham, Japheth, and then all of these are descendants of Shem. All right, now that is a very different interpretation of history, all right, than the conventional view. The conventional view is Africans first, and then from Africans you have different lineages evolving from that, which are basically out of Africa, right? Everyone's heard of that, sort of the idea of an African origin and then migration out of Africa into all the other groups from there. He reroots the tree and places Noah in this other position, and then everything flows from Noah out to all the tips of the branches in what's an unrooted tree, which I'll show you in a moment. So this is straight from his book. All right, so he's flipped that tree on its side, and then he has redrawn the tree such that the root, which is really hard to tell here, but the root's out here somewhere. And then you have the son, the other son, and then the third son, and they give rise to all these different lineages. So there's your 3 different lineages, and all humans alive today fall within these 3 lineages, right? That's the young Earth creationist vision of human history. By the way, I have to toss in here, I don't really understand the emphasis on saying Jeanson has found the Rosetta Stone of human history, because obviously the Rosetta Stone of human history is the Bible, according to Ken Ham and Nathaniel Jeanson, right? They would say the Bible tells us about human history. It tells us about Ham, Japheth, and Seth. There's no molecular biology that tells you about those 3. You simply assign to molecular biology the existence of these 3 individuals and try to find them in the history of the molecules, right? So to say that you found the Rosetta Stone of history, I think the Rosetta Stone of history is the Bible. And surely we're not going to suggest that Jeanson has discovered the Bible, right? So I just find that curious. Little side note there. All right, so this is the vision, his reinterpretation of the Y chromosome phylogeny of humanity, and it also includes and must incorporate the fact that these lineages, in conventional ways of thinking in terms of how fast the Y chromosome evolves and changes over time, this would take tens of thousands, if not in some cases over 100,000 years, for this number of mutations to accumulate in these lineages. Jeanson's saying, no, from this point right here, it's only taken 4,500 years to accumulate all the changes. But you'll notice that there are some lines that are much longer down here. And what you need to know about this phylogeny is the length of the line represents the number of changes, right? That the length of the line represents the number of mutations that have occurred. And so in the lineages down here, these happen to be the deepest African lineages here. I've actually cut it off so it actually sticks out here. They're very, very long. And so Jeanson has to propose that they have a faster mutation rate than most other human beings do. And so there's actually a deviation or a change in the mutation rate. So he's having to play with the rates of evolution in order to squeeze all this history into 4,500 years. Okay, now another way of looking at that same data was published earlier by Rob Carter, who's a young Earth creationist at Creation Ministries International, and he's already had published a phylogeny of Y chromosomes and talked about Noah and mitochondrial Eve, so talking about the female line. But in that paper, he talks about Y chromosomes and shows this particular phylogeny. Now, this is truly an unrooted phylogeny. And an unrooted phylogeny, each one of these letters here represents different haplotypes, the different Y chromosome types. So, for example, I'm an R1b, so my Y chromosome is somewhere right over here. And in fact, Ken Ham is an R1b, and Nathaniel Jeanson's also an R1b. So we're all actually, look at this, we're all closely related to one another. We can find our most recent common ancestor much more recently than I can find my common ancestor with, say, group A1 or A0, the first lineage in the modern conventional chronology. All right, so what Carter is pointing out is that the root in the conventional way of thinking is about right here. And so the line leading to human beings splits and into various African lineages, and then eventually splits into all the other lineages that come out of Africa. But what is Jeanson doing? Jeanson's saying Noah is right here on this particular phylogeny. He's saying that Jeanson had 3 sons. One of them that gave rise to all these, another one that gave rise to all these, and another one that gave rise to all these. The Hamitic line. This is the Shemite line down here, and this is Japheth right here, the 3 sons. Not going to get into like how he chose that particular point, but honestly, it's basically eyeballing if I want to just sum it up. There's no scientific method, right, to this. It's sort of like I looked at the tree and it looks like that's a nice place to put Noah. All right, now that we've got that out of the way, right? Now that we've kind of oriented ourselves as to what Jeanson's looking at, the type of data that he's looking at. Remember, he hasn't really done a lot of analysis himself to this point. He's really relying on secular research, and now he's going to apply his sort of reinterpretation to it. Now, again, this is a statement from Amazon.com and from the website Answers in Genesis promoting his book. Jeanson's research reveals family tree of the human race and is one of the most significant contributions in creation research to date. I mean, really pumping this book up. This is one of the most important books that creation scientists have come up with. His bold claims include, and then there's a long list of like the things that he's discovered by reinterpreting this phylogeny. He's been able to make these new interpretations because it actually does change the way you view migration of humans and so forth around the peopling of the earth is a little bit different story in his interpretation than the conventional interpretation. Like the obvious one, human beings don't come from Africa, they come from the Middle East in his view. I'm not going to cover all those. What I'm going to say is, what doesn't it include? A family tree that does not include Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other fossil human lineages. So his bold claims don't accommodate other human beings. So he hasn't really explained the family tree of the human race until he has explained Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other fossil human lineages and incorporated them into that history. Right now, they're just kind of like other things outside of history that don't have a place. All right, let's look at what he needs to accommodate, right? Where he needs to fit some things in. Now, one of the hard things for young Earth creationists is figuring out what needs to fit into the human race and what needs to be fit into the great ape kind. Because really, for Answers in Genesis, there's 2 kinds. There's humankind and there's ape kind. And so every single fossil, every single representative that we have seen on this earth must fit into one of those 2 categories. Now, what I'm showing you here is one depiction of possible relationships of different fossil taxa. And I'm saying possible phylogeny because there's lots of disputes about this and lots of different interpretations. And so we're just using this for illustration. and for sort of gaining some common language here going forward. So let's go way up here in derived Homo, and we'll see Homo sapiens. Right? Homo sapiens are what every one of us are. And in really what Jeanson has done is he's tried to provide an explanation for the history of Homo sapiens. Only Homo sapiens. Those are every person that's alive today. What is their ancestry? Tracing it back to the 3 sons of Noah. However, there's a little bit of a problem here. You've got Denisovans, you have Neanderthals, you have Homo heidelbergensis, and you have a variety of other possible species. Some people dispute whether they're different species or not. You've got Homo naledi, which Answers in Genesis says is not a human. They say that that's an ape. But Homo erectus, they say, is a human. Oh, let's get rid of this ink because it's going to get messy here. All right, so what exactly are humans? Well, I can't, from the young Earth creationist perspective, I can't really give you the answer because the answer is different depending on which young Earth creationist you talk to. But we'll say that some young Earth creationist will draw a circle around, well, let's do this to make it simple here. We'll say like all of these are human beings. And therefore, if all of those are human beings and they're all found in post-flood sediments, then Noah is down here, right? And Noah had 3 sons, and those 3 sons had to have evolved. Their Y chromosome had to have been evolved into all of these different groups, including all the modern Homo sapiens. So in this perspective, Jeanson's missing a massive portion of the diversity of the human race, of human beings, the humankind that are descendants of Noah. And he has to squeeze all of these into just 4,500 years. Their existence and then their extinction all at the same time. Now, Answers in Genesis is not quite that liberal with how they define humankind. Because as I said, they don't think Homo naledi is. They think that's an ape. So let's just draw it this way. Let's say it's more like this. Right? Which means you have Noah's right here. And I said, for different creationists, Noah is in a different place. This is Noah right here. And then Noah gives rise to Homo erectus and then a variety of other things. Except there is one problem. They think that Homo floresiensis, right over here, is also a human being. So we got to throw that one over there too. But some of these others may not be human beings. They may be apes, in which case we'd say, okay, we got to draw a line around here. And all of this, all right, all of these extinct things, all of which, by the way, were walking upright, they're all actually related to other great apes like chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans. Right, so all of that diversity can be thrown out into that other group. All right, so we're still setting the stage for, okay, Jeanson has done a particular analysis, he's done a reinterpretation. How is that going to affect how these other things get interpreted? All right. So here's one of my big problems with Traced. There's only 3 times that Neanderthals are mentioned in the entire book. And I know from looking at chat streams and other discussion on the internet, one of the big questions people have, and when I say people, I mean young Earth creationists, followers of young Earth creationists who are like, we hear about Neanderthals all the time, and we're told all the time that Neanderthals they're just human beings, right? Ken Ham just says, like, they're just as human as any other human. There's really no difference to them, some morphological differences, but they're just humans. And so, of course, people want to know, like, well, okay, so where do Neanderthals fit in? How did they arise from one of the sons of Noah? And Jeanson just basically completely ignores them in the book. And that's kind of annoyed a lot of people because that's one of the things they're really curious about. Here's the one mention that actually has any meaning at all. The other 2 are just thrown in there because he has to say the word Neanderthal when he's talking about a variety of other things. And so they do give us no information. But on page 183, he says, presumably, these cradles arose shortly after Babel, or as these cradles of civilization. This would have placed them within a few centuries after the beginning of human history. Therefore, events dated even earlier in the mainstream version of history, such as the rise and fall of Neanderthals, the Stone Age, agricultural revolution, all would have transpired within these early centuries. Now, so remember, I didn't point this out before, but after the flood, you have the Tower of Babel, in which all humanity, in most young Earth creationist mind, that means all peoples that are descendant of Noah, came together at Babel. And then they dispersed across the world. But that Babel event occurred several hundred years after the flood. And so now we're talking about only 4,100 years ago. And then you had to have Neanderthals, you had to have the Stone Age, and you had to have the agricultural revolution. All that had to happen. Well, he's saying that must have all happened within the very first couple centuries at that point. So within just a few hundred years, you had this entire history that conventional, dating and understanding of human history would say the Neanderthals are they are in existence for hundreds of thousands of years. And that the agricultural revolution, but the Stone Age is an exceedingly long time as well. Nathaniel Jeanson is going to compress that into just a few hundred years. All right. So with respect to Neanderthals, so the point there is that doesn't really tell you anything about what he thinks Neanderthals are, other than they must have existed in some short time frame right after Babel. So that's the only hint you get of what Neanderthals are doing. But he doesn't say anything about how they're related to other organisms. And you might say, well, but those are fossils. How would he know? Because he's doing a molecular analysis. We're looking at Y chromosomes. But there is a Y chromosome for Neanderthals. We've extracted DNA from Neanderthals. We've sequenced their entire genome, and we've sequenced their Y chromosome. And not only that, we've sequenced the Denisovan Y chromosome. And the Denisovans are another fossil species, more from Central Asia, or I guess Eastern Asia. And that's been sequenced as well. And so here's a paper from 2020, recent enough that he could have included it in his book, right? In Science, the Evolutionary History of Neanderthal and Denisovan Y Chromosomes. So that Y chromosome data is available and was there to be able to do the analysis and incorporate them into his history of the human race, right? He has the Rosetta Stone, right, for understanding the history of the human race. So why not apply the Rosetta Stone to Neanderthals? Now, I know what one of his answers is. You can't trust the sequence because it's ancient DNA, 300,000 years old DNA, but he would say it's only 4,000-year-old DNA, right? That's really not that old. But nonetheless, he would say that it's corrupted, and therefore you can't trust the sequence, and so it might not be. That's an excuse. I don't know any other way to say it, but that is just an excuse because we have multiple sequences of Neanderthals from multiple different locations. Now, true, Y chromosomes. We have a limited number of Y chromosome sequences, but we have sequences from many other portions of the Neanderthal genome from multiple locations, in which case we can check. And what we find is that we are able to identify, scientists aren't dummies. They know that there are certain types of decay products in DNA that will lead to errors, but we know how to identify those errors. And we know we have statistical tests for determining the places where those errors will occur. And we can actually weed those out, and we can use the better sequence for these types of analyses. So it was going to be possible for Jeanson to find good sequence from Neanderthals and use it in his analysis. He doesn't. Now, why doesn't he? Let's look at what happens when you add Neanderthals and Denisovans to the sequence. Right? So what they've done is they've taken the sequence, and right here is all the Y chromosome sequences from all modern humans, right? A00 is the oldest or the most divergent lineage, African lineage. And again, like I said, it's quite divergent, right? So over here on this tree, this is this line here. You see this double hash mark? When you see that on a phylogeny, it just means we didn't have enough space to draw this really, so it sticks up here. It's like, wow, we're really, 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 really different. And then we have to come all the way down here in terms of that many mutations in order to get back to how that lineage is related to other lineages. And so, yes, all the variation in the Y chromosome. So what in Jeanson's book, whereas, Noah is right here, right? Noah is right here. Noah stands at the common ancestry of all modern humans. And so they fit within there. In fact, most modern humans fit within a very small window. We're all very, very, very similar. Now, where do the Neanderthals fall? All right, the Neanderthals, on this particular phylogeny, they fall outside, right? And there's these big lines to 3 different lineages of Neanderthal Y chromosomes. So it's not just one Neanderthal. These 3 Neanderthals are quite different. Now, why are they so different from each other? Maybe there are a few mutations that are not real mutations and the result of decay of the DNA, right? So as a result of their being so ancient. However, the sequences are all similar to one another compared to everything else. So they're consistent in that fashion. They're from different locations, and yet they have similar results, and they group outside of the variation of all modern humans. And then you got the Denisovans. There's 2 sequences of Y chromosome from Denisovans, and those 2 Denisovans are much more different, okay? Remember, the length of the line represents the amount of change, the amount of difference between that lineage and another. They're way outside of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So, takeaway from this is, had Jeanson included Neanderthals and Denisovans in his analysis, he would have ended up with huge long branches going out to them, in which case he would have to suggest, as he's already done, he's already suggested that the African lineages have a much higher mutation rate, like even higher than the mutation rate that formed everybody else on Earth, which is already many times the rate of mutation that conventional theory suggests is what's happening, right? So the mutation rate or substitution rate is considerably lower by most analysis by anthropologists and systematists, right? And then he has to come in and say, no, you're all wrong. It's really much, much, much faster, in order to squeeze all of everyone outside of Africa into his 4,500 years. And then he's got the African lineages, and he's like, well, okay, but they're sped up even faster. Like, they have an even higher mutation rate. Well, then what happens if you add Neanderthals and Denisovans? All of a sudden you're going to have to double or triple the mutation rate in order to try to squeeze them all in. But he has to do that, right? Because what does he believe? I'm sure he believes that Noah is here, right? Noah is here because one of his sons gave rise to the Denisovans and Neanderthals, because he believes that Neanderthals and Denisovans are human beings. Now, let me back up on that. I don't know if I've ever heard him actually say that, but that's certainly the position of Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham. So maybe he has his own private thoughts that these are actually different species that are not related to human beings. And I would commend him if that's what he thinks. But that's not the official position of the organization he works for. And so if he's going to produce the Rosetta Stone of human history and explain all of human history and the genetics of human history, then he needs to accommodate Denisovans and Neanderthals into that history. And to do so, he's going to have to stretch his mutation rates out even further and make them even less likely, right? They're already kind of ridiculously high, right? Unrealistically high. And he'll have to vastly increase those mutation rates to try to wrap the Denisovans and modern and Neanderthals into that. Now, I haven't even mentioned there are other archaic or fossil species of hominins that Nathaniel Jeanson probably thinks are also human if he takes the position of Answers in Genesis. And we don't have molecular sequence for all of them, but we do for one from the pit of bones in Cimo de los Huesos cave in Spain. And we know that its mitochondrial DNA and its genomic DNA is even more different than Denisovans. So who knows how different some of those other fossil species are if we ever get sequence from it. And I think we will get some sequence from some of those others. So in other words, Jeanson's model is going to be tested even further because I'll make a prediction. Jeanson likes to make predictions. I'll make a prediction. If we get sequence from Homo floresiensis or Homo naledi or Homo erectus, it's going to be even more different, right, than any other Homo species that we've ever seen before, which is going to make Jeanson's model even less likely. Right? It's going to be even harder to accommodate all humans within his particular model that he's proposed. All right, so we've got another problem. Okay, Jeanson has another problem, and it's the great ape problem. All right, if it requires proposing much faster rates of mutation to explain all living humans within 4,500 years, and I've just got done explaining that he has to propose very high rates just to accommodate living humans, and then yet higher rates to squeeze in Neanderthals, and then Denisovans, and then potentially other fossil species, then what does Jeanson think of Answers in Genesis views of the great ape kind? Remember, I said that Answers in Genesis proposes and is very public with their view that there was one Y chromosome on the ark. That one Y chromosome then evolved into the Y chromosomes in orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees, and a whole bunch of other upright walking, even though they're not shown that way, upright walking hominins that they say aren't related to human beings. Now let's ask the question, how different are those Y chromosomes from each other? And how likely is it that those differences could have evolved in just 4,500 years? We've got data for that. Jeanson, I've looked through Jeanson's papers and in his book at his references. He does not reference these papers. So either he hasn't thought to sort of read outside of just modern humans, and he's been so focused on trying to understand them. But what I'd suggest is one way to ask yourself if your radical idea, and it is a radical idea that Jeanson's proposing, for reinterpreting the molecular data, if you want to imagine that makes any sense at all, here's what you need to ask yourself. How would it affect my interpretation of other groups? Right? If I took my reinterpretation here and I tried to transport it and apply it to other Y chromosomes, which are probably evolving in a very similar fashion. There's not a reason to believe that they're acting different in terms of the way that mutations happen. If I apply that to other groups, can I make sense of, and does it fit for other groups too? Or is what he's come up with is just an ad hoc solution for explaining human beings? And not to give it all away, but that's what it is. What he has come up with is an ad hoc solution for a specific problem. I've got to squeeze all human beings into 4,500 years, right? He doesn't really care about all the other species that are out there and what the interpretations of kinds are of those. But if I'm going to do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, if you're consistent, and you're going to now say that this is the way the world operates, right? These mutation rates, these substitution rates, let's apply it to other groups and see whether your model actually helps explain other things. That's what a good model does, right? That's what a good hypothesis does, is it will help explain other groups and other information that you didn't originally, that wasn't your original plan. And if it does help you, that bolsters your own theory. Right? It supports your own hypothesis. But if you try looking at other groups and apply your own ideas to other data sets, and it doesn't make any sense, then you probably should go back and think, well, maybe my original hypothesis doesn't make sense. Okay? It's not actually helping me explain anything in the world other than my preconceived notions about how humans are already related to one another. All right, so this paper, the Y chromosome of the great apes. This sounds like it would be a very important paper to know something about, right? This is from 2017. So this is a comparison of the Y chromosome among great ape lineages. So here, first, let's start with the structure of the Y chromosome. So this is just a map of Y chromosomes showing you can think of it as kind of like the the gross morphology of a chromosome, the external appearance of the chromosome. The different the color portions here represent different structural elements of the DNA of the chromosomes. Remember, chromosomes are DNA, but the DNA is wound up around histones, which are proteins. And then they could be really bunched up or they could be stretched out. There's all kinds of different conformations they can take, and those stain differently, and that's where you get this banding pattern. And so the banding pattern actually is an expression of sort of the overall structure of a chromosome. And so if you see the same banding pattern between two chromosomes, you can assume that those two chromosomes have a similar structural features, and so they may be being used in very similar fashions. And you'll notice here that the X chromosome is a whole heck of a lot longer than the Y chromosome. I think most people are aware the human Y chromosome is a tiny little chromosome, right? It's diminutive compared to all the other chromosomes. We males are greatly shortchanged over females, which have two X chromosomes and a lot more DNA as a result. All right, so if you look at the X chromosome of a human and a chimpanzee, you'll see, wow, the banding pattern is almost the same. Yes, structurally, the X chromosomes of chimpanzees and humans are very, very similar. But it's notable that the Y chromosome, where's my pen? Here we go. Here's the Y chromosome of a male human. Here's the Y chromosome of a chimpanzee. Chimpanzees have even shorter Y chromosomes than humans do. And so there's some pretty significant differences here. This is millions of base pair differences. So they have some different genes, and there's big chunks that are missing in chimpanzees. Now, what often doesn't get said is that the bonobo, all right, so remember, most people think of chimps and they just think of chimpanzees, but the chimp lineage includes two species. There's the chimpanzee and the bonobo, which is kind of like a small version of a chimp, but it's a different species. That bonobo has a much larger chromosome than the chimpanzee. And so I know all creationists that I know of say that chimps and bonobos are very similar to each other and they're the same kind. So they must come from a common ancestor. That alone should tell you the Y chromosome can change a lot, right? If this is only 4,500 years, the Y chromosome has changed considerably in size between bonobos and chimpanzees. And so a great amount of structural change can occur over a short period of time within the young Earth creationist framework. And then if you look over here at gorillas, they have a much larger larger Y chromosome than human beings do. And then you look at the orangutans, and there's Bornean orangutans and there's Sumatran orangutans, which aren't called different species, but they're considered subspecies. And they have differences between their Y chromosomes, even though they're part of the same species. Right? So first lesson here is Y chromosomes can experience dramatic changes. I mean, it's pretty self-evident here that even within a species, you can have large changes in the structure of a Y chromosome. But of course, what we want to ask now is, what about the actual sequence of the Y chromosome? Because that's what's been used to make this haplotype tree or haplotype phylogeny of the ancestry of human beings. Can we make an ancestry of all the great apes, including humans or not including humans? And so here's what we get. So in that same paper, we have this tree, which I really like because it kind of visually helps you get a feel for the overall genetic diversity in these different groups. And it's going to help me make my point here. All right. I've been building up to this whole time. All right. So here we have humans. All right. And in human beings, if we were to scale, and then, so I got to show the scale here, 1,000 mutations. So this much of this line means there's 1,000 mutations. So the distance from this common ancestor to the common ancestor of chimps and humans is thought to have had about, over 2,000 changes in the Y chromosome in the DNA sequence. And then from that ancestor, so in the conventional way of viewing the history of hominids, hominids, right? You have a relationship between chimps and human beings, and there's the common ancestor. And from that common ancestor had a Y chromosome, and that Y chromosome underwent some changes, and it underwent thousands of changes. But then since the most recent common ancestor of all living humans, and that's what's being shown here, the most recent male common ancestor of all human beings. So if you want to call that Adam, let's call that Adam here. This is how much change has occurred in the Y chromosome. If you scale it on this 1,000 changes being this length, all right, only 200 or so changes. So that's the difference between the most diverse human beings on Earth. They all fit into this. It's all squinched down, right? Because it's just not that much difference relative to the great apes. Now look at the chimpanzees. This is really interesting. I point this out in my class all the time. The chimpanzees, this is all scaled the same way, are way more diverse. In other words, if you take two chimpanzees, there's a good chance that any two chimpanzees, if they're not in the same family group, right? Two different family groups, a fair distance away from each other, they're probably going to be more different genetically from each other than any two humans are on the face of the earth. Right? Chimpanzees have more diversity, even though they're limited to a small geographical space and they're a much smaller population. They have more genetic diversity than human beings do. That's really interesting. And then you have the bonobos, and they're quite different than chimpanzees. Now look how different gorillas are. Like they're thousands of base pairs different than chimpanzees. And then you got to get over to orangutans. And remember what I said about the double hash marks here? That means there's a break there. That means we just couldn't show all the differences. We needed to compress this for our figure. So it's actually a lot more than it looks. So if you say to yourself, okay, look, remember we started out with that first figure and we said, all of these, I'm going to draw a circle right now. All of this is one kind. One kind, which means on the arc, there was one Y chromosome that got off the arc, and then it evolved into all of these Y chromosomes in these four different groups. It is a massive amount of change. And don't forget, Jeanson is trying to explain all of this variation in 4,500 years. And in order to squish it down into 4,500 years, he has to increase the mutation rate by a lot in order to try to compress all of the changes, all the hundreds of changes among human beings into that small space. Now imagine, what is he going to do to try to squish all of the great apes into 4,500 years? He's got to fit all of this change from here to here. He's got to fit it all into 4,500 years. That's a challenge. That's a serious problem, for him. Let me expand this tree and look at the bottom portion of it. So now what they've done there is they've just stretched out each of these different lineages to show you the amount of diversity within those lineages. So now we have human beings and we stretched it out. So now we have 100 mutations, not 1,000. And then when you do that, you get, here's the variation among human beings, right? So the most different human beings are, this much different. So that's 200 differences. Great. Oh, by the way, this doesn't include Neanderthals, but I'm kind of disappointed that they didn't include Neanderthals in this phylogeny, but it's a little bit older paper. But Neanderthals would probably be like boom, boom. All right. They're definitely outside of the rest of the variation of human beings, but they're not radically so. And then Denisovans would be like out here. And then as I'm predicting, we'll eventually find lineages that are even more different. Right. But I think creationists will always still draw a line around the whole thing and then say Noah is here. All right, but now we can look at the difference between chimpanzees and humans. Here's chimpanzees. Right? Oh, I'm sorry. This is chimpanzees right here. That's how different they are from one another. All right, as a species. They have a huge amount of variation. In order to compress all that variation into generations, like remember, a chimpanzee generation is not that much shorter than a human generation. And so they've had a similar number of total generations of males from the flood until present as there are human beings. And so in order to get that many differences from a single Y chromosome all the way to that point, really, really hard. Oh, and don't forget, this is attached to all these other lines way back here, which included another 1,000 mutations, even to get to the point where the common ancestor happened to make chimpanzees. When did all that happen? Like, when did all those mutations happen? All these other lineages have probably been around for thousands of years. All right, so I think that Answers in Genesis has a big issue here. And I've made a big deal about this before, how ridiculous it is for them to try to say that gorillas and chimpanzees are the same kind, and then act as if human beings are so incredibly different than them when they're not showing nearly as much diversity as these other groups. All right, so by trying to solve one problem, I think Jeanson actually creates many more for young Earth creationists, right? There's not enough support for substitution rates, his accelerated substitution rate, to justify reinterpreting the conventional Y chromosome chronology, right? So I just don't think that he's made a strong enough case to adjust the substitution rate in order to compress all of those mutations into 4,500 years. So that alone is a problem for his thesis. But as I said before, even if we just grant him, like, okay, maybe someday we'll find a way you'll find some more support for that, and we could say, yes, there could have been that fast of a mutation rate in human beings. Even if he does that, he's ignored the inconvenient data that is the Neanderthal genetic data set. So he should have used the Neanderthal genetic data set and then come up with his substitution rate from there. The problem with that was he's trying to find real data from secular journals to try to support what he's saying, so he can say that what he's concluding is based on actual science. He's trying not to say that I started with the Bible and I know how old these are, and I'm simply going to take that date and I'm going to divide all the mutations and I'm going to come up with my own substitution rate and just say that's what it is. He's trying to say, I think somebody's actually measured this rate in the real world, and therefore I can apply it to this tree, and then it supports the Bible. But we all know he's really doing it in a reverse direction. He knows the answer, and he's trying to find evidence to support it. And this is the reason he has to kick out the Neanderthals, right? He has to find an excuse for the Neanderthals, because if he includes the Neanderthals, the rates that he is finding in the secular literature, which he doesn't really understand, but he's plucking those out of their context and then trying to say that that rate can be applied to this Y chromosome phylogeny. But he knows that he can't use those rates if he includes the Neanderthals. All right, so he couldn't come up with a scientific justification for his entire human history reinterpretation. So he just left Neanderthals out, right? And he has a bunch of, devices to try to explain away why they're not included. But someday he has to add them, right? That's that's a real thing out there, and he can't ignore them forever. And unfortunately, it's going to make him have to reconsider a lot of what he's done when he finally convinces himself that the Neanderthal sequence is good enough to be included in the data set. Right? So he ignores the inconvenient data, the Neanderthal data set, and that includes the Denisovan data set as well, and what I think will be future data sets, which are going to make it even more complicated for him. So he can't really accommodate all these other fossil human lineages. And if they are part of the human race, if they are the descendants of Noah, then they also, in order to claim that you have traced human history, you have to trace their history as well and show how they fit within your young Earth chronology. And then fourth, it makes the Answers in Genesis interpretation of the ark kind completely untenable. Right? I think it's just ridiculous for them to continue to try to claim that all apes other than human beings evolved from a common ancestor. I mean, honestly, what happens is you look at chimps, orangutans, and gorillas, and you ask yourself, how could you say that humans couldn't have evolved from one of them? If those three could have evolved from a common ancestor, because they're genetically more different from each other than humans are from chimpanzees, right? So you can no longer claim what he's doing is he's creating a problem. He's creating a problem because somebody could say, like myself, could say, look, you look at those Y chromosomes and you're claiming that they're really different from each other. Like the Y chromosome from human is really different than chimp. But the chimp Y chromosome is more different from the orangutan than it is from a human being. So, but if orangutans and chimpanzees could have come from a common ancestor, then clearly the human Y chromosome and a chimp chromosome could have come from a common ancestor. You can't exclude that possibility on the scientific evidence alone. You can say my biblical interpretation doesn't allow that to happen, but you can't be out there claiming that science shows that this is impossible when you just showed that science makes it possible, since you're saying that they do have a common ancestor. The chimps and orangutans have a common ancestor. All right, so here's what my advice would be. Answers in Genesis should give up on the common ancestry of great apes. They should say that gorillas are a kind, that chimpanzees are a kind, maybe even bonobos are a kind, but I'll give them bonobos and chimps having a common ancestor, but it's going to create a problem for Traced. And orangutans are a separate kind. But of course that means there has to be two additional lineages on Noah's Ark. So Noah's Ark starts to get more crowded when you do this. But that would be my suggestion. I think that's more faithful to the data, right? Call them different kinds, and it'd be more consistent than trying to say human beings are completely separate, at the same time saying they're not separate from each other. The other thing I would suggest for Nathaniel Jeanson is, I want to know who made that figure that they use at the Creation Museum. All right, who made that decision that they're going to lump together all the great apes? Was Nathaniel Jeanson involved in that? I've never heard him talk about that. I think it was Gene Leitner, who is an independent researcher who Answers in Genesis kind of used as an outside consultant for a lot of their Ark Encounter stuff in terms of figuring out what kinds are, and she places all those in the same kind. And so maybe they just went with her, but what analysis was that based on? It wasn't based on really no analysis, just kind of like, hey, this seems to kind of maybe work. It wasn't based on being able to hybridize with each other. It wasn't based on any genetic data that I know of. And so why isn't Nathaniel Jeanson coming to Ken Ham and saying, you know what, my analysis, right, of the genetic data, if I think through like, okay, here's what I did, and if we're convinced that this is an accurate history and this represents the rates of change that can happen since the flood, I'm looking at this other data also created by secular, by conventional systematists and molecular biologists using the same methods. And if I'm applying my logic now to that data, we can no longer be saying that chimps and gorillas are the same kind, right? That just doesn't work because that's going to undermine my book, all right? That undermines the results of my book. He should be more proactive in terms of sculpting the positions of Answers in Genesis, right? He's the only one there that presumably has this knowledge and ability to interpret this data. And he needs to use that to change not just their view of human. Actually, he hasn't changed their views of humans at all, right? He's simply supporting their view of how humans are related to one another. But he needs to be having a much stronger effect on their views of kinds and the limits of kinds, the genetic limits on kinds. All right, so I think so what I've done here is I've just tried to show you that if we look at a broader perspective, if we try to apply his data outside of his limited scope, we start to really see the problems that his own data creates, right? So it raises more questions about his analysis than it does giving any support to his analysis. And I would hope that these are things that he should have considered before writing the book. Right? These are the types of things he needed to explore prior to simply coming to a decision in which he's so focused just on living human ancestry. He has to consider the broader picture. And so he's not being very proactive in terms of like, okay, how is he going to accommodate future data? the predictions he makes, I'm going to predict, aren't going to come true. If he's going to make predictions about where these fossil sequences fall into place. And that's kind of the curious thing too. He doesn't really even try to make those predictions. Right? It feels like he knows that they're a problem, and so he's not going to predict what's going to happen when those fossil sequences get incorporated into these Y chromosome phylogenies. All right, that's my take on the great apes and a problem for traced. So, like I said, those are the untraced lineages. And the untraced lineages, they tell a story. And that story isn't supportive of Nathaniel Jeanson's conclusions. All right, thanks a lot. I'm sure I'll have a lot more to say about this book, and we'll continue our series on This Week in Creationism fairly soon. And we'll take in fact, I'm pretty sure that what we're going to see in that series as well is we're going to see other cases of my being able to apply his mutation rates and logic to other kinds. And we'll see if he has any success in explaining the limits of biblical kinds using his model outside of human beings. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Hit that subscribe button. Thanks for all of your comments. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about my little diatribe about traced. Bye-bye.